Welcome to this week's edition of the CommonSpace Show. I'm David Jameson.
And I'm Rhiannon Davis, and we're joined today by freelance journalist Karin Goodwin. Karin writes a lot about social issues in Scotland, and particularly around kind of homelessness and housing, and we'll be talking a bit about that in the second half.
I don't see why the district council frontline staff don't tell people their rights. Why do people like Shelter have to take me up to the casework team to fight for my rights?
But first up, David, we're going to talk about some of the week's big issues.
Yes, in the first half we're going to be discussing, first of all, Trump laying claim to Greenland.
Essentially, it's a large real estate deal. A lot of things could be done, but we'll talk to them a little bit.
Karen, I don't know if you've seen this. We've had a couple of tweets. One was a Trump tower, strategically placed in a very dainty-looking suburb in Greenland, as a display of what Trump will not do to the island. When I saw that, I thought, at least he's got a sense of humour. He understands, that people don't want that gaudiness and all that kind of stuff. But almost immediately after that, he actually cancelled the diplomatic meeting with the leader of Denmark because the purchase of Greenland would not be on the table. There's always a debate here about, is this 3D chess? Is it brilliant? Is this a great PR strategy? Or is he just a man with a Twitter account going crazy? What's your take on that?
You can really swing either way on it, can't you? I mean, on one hand, it's just insanity and just everybody is just left completely and utterly dumbfounded by this kind of, even for him, pretty outlandish kind of behaviour. And then on another, you think, well, is it just that sort of, if you create a situation in which literally nothing will surprise people about you, then you can behave more or less how you want. So, is it actually? Are we getting distracted by it? Basically, is it the same kind of Boris Johnson kind of technique of look at this funny hand here while I fiddle the millions over here?
Or is it paving the way for something much more kind of dangerous? I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Years ago, people said that they wouldn't allow him to be normalised as a figure. They wouldn't allow him to change the landscape of politics such that it sort of conforms to his almost like really surreal and postmodern style of governance. But he has changed the landscape.
Absolutely.
People. There's not a national crisis when he cancels meetings with foreign leaders because they refuse to sell part of their country. And the other thing that I find interesting about this is, and how just enormously offensive this feels in Greenland, is that Greenland has quite a tense relationship with Denmark. Because there's quite a large secessionist sentiment, I think. So it is very much like Trump saying, I'm cancelling this meeting with Boris Johnson because he won't sell me Scotland or he won't sell me Wales. It's, that is extraordinary.
But isn't that far-fetched? You can actually imagine him coming over here with his wanting some more golf clubs and thinking, I'll just buy all of Scotland and then I can do what I want here. I saw it today as well. He had a press conference where it was not just the fact that, it wasn't the fact that Denmark had refused to sell him Greenland, but it was the way that they'd done it. So he said that if she'd done it more nicely, I think his specific words were, if he just said, it's okay, we'd rather not sell you Greenland, then that wouldn't have been so kind of offensive to his precious ego. But it's because they couldn't believe that it was a real request that he took umbrage with.
It's the other thing I find fascinating about Trump is, though, people say that he's like the manifestation of sort of like wounded masculinity or something like that. He's actually very open with his feelings. He's constantly telling people how offended he is by them. You should have said that. He really would say more nicely, and so on. But also today, slightly more sinister, he tweeted out a lengthy quote that a right-wing radio host had put out, where he described himself as the King of Israel and the second coming of God. I have to wonder if at this point, there were all these theories early on that he was,
unwell.
His brain capacity wasn't up to the job and all that kind of stuff. I wonder if the fatigue of the job, the upcoming campaign, means that he is actually becoming increasingly detached from reality. And, you know, it just makes you wonder what this campaign is going to look like. Are you looking forward to the 2020 runoff?
I mean, it just, when you, in a day like today, it's just baffling, isn't it, how that will look. And actually, as you say as well, how dangerous some of the things that might come out of that are. And yeah, either of the two possibilities here of him being really just quite unwell, or him, you know, sort of proceeding down a kind of populist route of just tear it all up, break it, you know, make it, you know, to a point where we can't actually fix our society in any kind of constructive way. Either of those are so terrifying that it's really difficult to know where we go from here or how we pull it back. So, yeah.
And you wonder what could happen if it looks like he's going to lose in the last dying throes with presidency. What else is he going to just bring about? And
people forget now that in the first election campaign, days before the actual vote, he was already making his excuses. He was saying, "I think the vote's rigged." So he was already telling his supporters that the vote has been rigged against me. He can never accept defeat or humiliation of any kind. So I suspect there'll be that, you know, if he was going to lose, there would be all that kind of stuff.
Just do away with the voting democracy because it's all corrupt anyway, and the enemy's behind it.
Fake news, fake elections, But as you say, it's the really disorientating thing about Trump is he's clowning around like this at a time of such enormous global issues. One of which, of course, is global climate change, and we've seen the debate around that infected by the same sort of cultural war concepts when it comes to, we were debating actually how to pronounce the second name, Greta Thunberg, I think was...
I think that's as close as you'll get, David.
So what is she doing? She's sailing from Britain to where?
To the US.
Right.
Yeah, because she didn't want to fly and she refuses to fly, so... You know, she's doing what most of us don't have the opportunity to do in our real lives. You know, if we have a conference or something, we need to go to the States. We might all quite like to take the boat there, but you know, she's got the opportunity to do it, and she's using it to make a point, but also, you know, sticking to her kind of guns, which I think is commendable.
And there was a backlash, but I do agree with what you're saying there. Is I'd much rather like travel slow. Do you know, like, I'd much rather we lived in a world where, like, EasyJet wasn't an option, assuming a number of other things, like you don't just have a week a year for holidays or something, right? And if you wanted to go to France or something, you could travel on the road. Do you know what I mean? But inevitably, anyway, this triggers the latest round of people having a go at her. And partly, I think people are sort of like, don't have a go at this teenager. And so on, who's trying to make a difference. I don't suppose you saw any of these comments, like Aaron Banks, for example. Yeah. This was much commented on.
Yeah, I did actually report it. Not that it's going to make any difference, but I do think it's an outrageous thing for anyone to say, and for a very powerful man to say about a teenage girl.
I actually missed that one. What did he say?
He said... What was it? What was the exact phrasing?
I can't remember what the exact phrasing was, but basically, yacht accidents do happen even in the summer.
Oh wow! Yeah. So it was a threat.
And it, you know, you could read it as light-hearted banter, which is what he would, I'm sure, argue that it was. But yeah, it was given his power and influence in the world, it can only really be read as a threat, right?
Yeah. And he wasn't the only one kind of laying into it. There were so many attacks from various kind of different parties.
Ideological attacks. There's been a lot of writing, I think, as well, about the way that she's being used and manipulated as a figurehead for a cabal of left-wing kind of extremists who dare to think that we should be getting on top of our completely unsustainable consumption of carbon. Which is just insulting on so many different levels, given the support that they have, given the backup and the cabal of people that they have around them, just in everyday interactions. So yeah, I think it's just unsurprising actually that she's such a threat, but really really depressing.
I think sometimes we resent her because she is a 16-year-old doing something purposeful with her life. When I was 16, I was just hanging around like a bad smell and getting on my parents' nerves. And my life was beyond that without reason. I do enjoy the kind of regression that people like Julia Hartley-Brewer, she was one of the ones who said, well, I'm getting a flight and there's nothing you can do about it. You're like, you're a middle-aged adult.
Yeah. And you're acting more childish than a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
A place of jealousy you're suggesting.
Well, possibly, but the thing that I don't understand is, I used to think that like the classic image of someone who was politically conservative or on the right, like Julia Hartley-Brewer is supposed to be, someone who's sort of austere and removed and above it all, above the triviality and the silliness of the world. But these days, the sort of conservative right is just, it's the most like, the most juvenile, constant, nipping away at people in the public sphere and so on.
I'm old enough to sort of almost remember the 80s, so I don't know, maybe I have a different perspective on that. Conservative was all about consumption and flaunting what you had, and I think we really are seeing that kind of coming round. And I guess that kind of argument isn't it, that people don't want to be told what to do, they don't want to be told to stop having fun. It's really boring to have to poo in a bucket.
But there's no kitchen, no toilet.
We will have to do it in a bucket, but I mean that is that is fine.
But the reality is that that's not really what this is about, and just it's a false flag to suggest that it is.
There is also a more interesting debate though, isn't there, in that Greta Thunberg, it may not be a sort of secret conspiracy of lefties. I don't know why people think all these millionaires and stuff are left wing, but anyway, but there is a kind of more legitimate criticism, isn't there, which is that a single individual who's a very kind of public not philanthropic figure, but a kind of public activist figure, taking a boat from Britain to the United States doesn't necessarily speak to the structural change that needs to happen in order for us to survive this era, or to the massive democratic forces which are needed to bring about that change. Do you know what I mean? There is an element of kind of managed dissent here. Do you know what I mean?
Sure, but it's symbolic rather than something suggesting that it's going to change the world. It's just simply making a point.
Yeah.
And it's working. People are talking about it.
Yeah, including...
I actually saw something today that's saying the stats of people flying in Sweden has gone down dramatically just in the past year, or in the past year in fact. This time compared to last year, they fly, I don't know the actual numbers, but people in Sweden specifically are flying much less. So maybe it's working.
Yeah, it's that kind of long-standing thing that if you can't imagine it, then you won't do it. So that's the argument for representation in anything, whether that's a female First Minister or Alistair Gray wrote Lanark because Glasgow hadn't featured in any literature, and people couldn't imagine it as a cultural interesting city, so it sort of didn't exist. So I think what you're saying about her taking a boat and saying, no, I'm going to do it differently, we can't all take a boat, but we can all think about other ways in which we as individuals can react, and I think that's actually quite empowering once you start feeling like that.
So long as you don't just say, I'm not doing what this bossy teenager is telling me to do, which is much of the commentary.
From the middle of the Atlantic back to somewhere much closer to home, we were in Glasgow in George Square this week to see Shelter deliver a letter to Glasgow City Council.
What have you been doing here today?
We've just delivered a letter to Glasgow City Council notifying them that they've got 28 days to respond to the outrage of 3,000 people being turned away from homelessness services across Glasgow last year. This is not just a new issue, this has been happening for several years. We've made representation to the leader of the council, to the previous leader of the council, to the chief executive, to the head of social care, to a number of city officials and members of the council as well, and despite that no action has been taken.
It's been my experience in the past with the same services as going in and being left homeless and ended up rough sleeping for over 6 years. The district council frontline staff don't tell people their rights. Why do people like Shelter have to take me up to the casework team to fight for my rights? Should the rights not be given to people?
There's 3,000 incidences of people being turned away. Add to that the fact that tragically there was over 40 people died in the streets of this city last year alone. Individual circumstances were very different for those people, but they were linked to being street homeless.
I would go in and I would give my name and they would say, sorry, there's nothing, there's 2 bus tokens, come back tomorrow. I don't know what they expected me to do with 2 bus tokens, and then I would do that day after day after day after day. Some eventually I would maybe get into a hostel sometimes. I never ever offered any sort of temporary accommodation or flats or anything. When I went to Chris, the lawyer from Shelter, and he explained it to me that it's illegal the way they're treating me. Suddenly I get put up in a hotel. From the hotel I get a temporary furnished flat, and I says, could I have done this 6 months ago? And he says, you've done this 6 years ago. So for all that time my rights have been getting taken away from me.
If they don't take action within 28 days, we are intending to go to the Court of Session and asking for judicial review of Glasgow City Council.
So yes, that was what happened on Monday when Shelter Scotland delivered a letter on behalf of people that had experienced homelessness to the council, telling them that they were going to start taking legal action if they didn't start meeting their legal obligations for providing temporary accommodation to people who were homeless. Karin, I saw you there at the protest. What did you make of that? What do you make of the kind of unprecedented action of Shelter taking this legal route?
Yeah, so I think it's been a long time coming. What struck me was, I went back through the pieces that I've written on that issue of gatekeeping or people being turned away from statutory services even when they have the right to be accommodated. And certainly, I've been writing about it for 5 years, just over 5 years, and I know that people have obviously been highlighting the problem in all sorts of ways before that as well. I know that people have been trying lots of different methods to fix things, and Glasgow City Council come out with an action plan. The housing regulator have been involved. They've it compelled them to do something about the fact that they're turning away so many people all the time. There's been moves towards different approaches. A huge fanfare around the Housing First model, which is exciting. And yet the reality is that people are just being turned away on a daily basis, and it just continues and continues. So I think the fact that Shelter decided that they should really put a kind of mark in the sand is a really interesting development, to be honest. And and really quite groundbreaking.
Yeah.
Because it's not normal, is it, for a large third sector organisation like Shelter to be this kind of overtly political? Is it not usually the case that an organisation like this, they're always thinking about, we need to have certain type of relationship with political entities, whereas this was relatively sort of aggressive by a third sector organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And they've not got contracts in that area with Glasgow City Council in the way that some of the third sector organisations in the city do, so possibly they're a bit freer to be that bold. They've got a UK-wide perspective, I suppose. I saw that the director of Shelter in England was also retweeting a lot on Monday, and obviously it's been a big journey that the organisation have been on. I think certainly when I started writing about homelessness, Shelter were very much advocating rightly for families who were spending too long in B&Bs, and that's a really horrendous situation, and I have written about it, but I suppose in terms of public sympathy, it's an easier sell for a charity. People can understand that children should not be homeless and that children should not be left in unsuitable and unsafe conditions. Whereas to talk about the type of men predominantly that are being turned away repeatedly from Glasgow services, there's sometimes less public sympathy. So from that perspective, I think it's really encouraging to see an organisation really, as you say, get behind something quite bold and advocate for the rights of people regardless of what their situation is.
Mm-hmm.
And we heard from Tam Lyon there, who sort of spoke about the fact that, you know, he'd been and asked for help and been given bus tickets and asked to come back, and there was a kind of expectation that he would find somewhere to sleep and come back the next day.
Sure.
I mean, you said you've spoken to Tam, but have you spoken to other people that have had the same experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really common story.
Mm-hmm.
I do, and I have done for a good few years now, a community media workshop at the Lodging House Mission, which is one of the day centres in the city. And while there's not so many people engaging in the workshops that are at such a sharp end, I speak to people in the day centre all the time who are having very similar experiences, and you hear the same things about being, you know, asked if there's anywhere at all that they can stay, and feeling kind of ashamed to say no sometimes, and sometimes just saying yes, going away, sometimes saying no, there's nowhere for me to go, and being told, well, there's no accommodation for you, sitting there for long periods of time, and just, you know, the time runs out and there's still nothing on the database, and then you get these kind of difficult situations where people have been told no so many times that they give up on the system, they stop trusting the system, they completely disengage, and then people start talking about failure to engage and how complicated situations and entrenched rough sleeping and all these things. And in actual fact, I think often if we listened to people from the start and took them seriously and understood the crisis that they were in, then you never get to that stage.
And Shout have given the council 28 days, I believe, to change their practice and to start kind of doing what they are, you know, supposed to do by law. How likely do you think that is that they're going to be doing that? How are they going to be making those changes?
I mean, I'd love to think that was possible. Obviously, Housing First is moving in the city from what I hear. People are beginning to be offered flats, and that was very slow compared to the target numbers of the number of people that were meant to be in those Housing First flats, which is basically a sort of an approach from the US that offers people a home straight from the streets, with a support package on the side, so that allows people to reintegrate and rebuild their lives. So that sort of beginning to happen, but I just don't see any evidence that can happen at the scale at which it would need to in order for shelter to be satisfied that their demands have been met and that they were going to back down. I think if Glasgow was able to do that, it would have done it long before now. I don't think that there's lots of caseworkers sitting saying, nah, I just don't fancy helping people. I think that there's obviously a will to help people, but that the system is just not fit for purpose. It's not working. And I think we need to get honest about that, and Glasgow City Council need to talk about what's going to help and how we can all fix it together. So yeah, hopefully it will be have some results. I know that not everybody is there's not a unanimous feeling that that's the right action to take, but at least it's action, right?
And speaking of action, it wasn't the only action that Glasgow City Council saw this week. We also saw on Tuesday a really large-scale protest taking place outside Glasgow City Council by no evictions and living rent, and people protesting against these Serco evictions.
Serco! Serco! Out of Glasgow! Serco! Serco! Out of Glasgow!
We are writing today to ask you, as leader of Glasgow City Council, to commit to provide emergency accommodation for asylum seekers and refugees who will be made homeless and destitute by Serco's evictions through lock changes. You have previously stated that providing housing to anyone who does not have a recourse to public funds would break the law. However, consular guidelines published in February 2019 state that public funds can be used for emergency accommodation. We request that evidence of the Council's working with other partners to implement the recommendations suggested in the Task Force report be made publicly available as soon as possible. We expect this information to include a clear timeline for social work assessments and support for everyone affected by the lock changes. You stated in August 2018, if carried out, Serco's planned evictions would result in a humanitarian crisis for Glasgow. We agree with your assessment of the situation that you previously made, but we also believe that you have the power to avert this crisis by taking immediate action to provide emergency housing. Living Right are a community tenant or union and part of the Glasgow No Evictions Network. Our members are constituents of Glasgow City Council who are collectively prepared to stand with our neighbours who face eviction and destitution, and as a result of this inhumane and racist evictions policy, we are organised and willing to take any actions necessary to prevent these evictions, and are actively canvassing support from other elected representatives in Glasgow, many of whom have already indicated their outrage at Serco's actions. We urge the Council to defy and confront the Home Office and Westminster by providing this accommodation regardless of the so-called consequences. Living Right will support the Council if they choose to take this action. If not, however, should Glasgow City Council fail to support our friends and neighbours at this critical point, we are prepared to escalate our actions and defend our rights, and thus further the safety, security and right to a home for everyone in Glasgow.
So that was Sean Bailey from the Living Rent Tenants Union reading out the letter that they had delivered to the Glasgow City Council against the eviction of these 300 asylum seekers. Did you see the response from Susan Aitken, Karen, and what were your kind of thoughts on what she had said?
Yeah, I did. I mean, to a certain extent, you know, this comes in a kind of Living Rent have been really kind of strident on kind of protesting against all the parties involved here. So you know, this it's not just about Glasgow City Council, but as Sean said there in reading out the letter, Glasgow City Council can actually make a difference in averting a humanitarian crisis. And so Susan Aitken's response was to say that it wasn't possible, that they were prevented by law. A lot of people would counter that and completely. There's COSLA guidelines that were published in February, which you know were developed with the help of the Glasgow City Council's own task force, which was set up after the fact that these evictions the law changes were going to come about. That says that public funds can be used, and in fact there are various bits of legislation, existing legislation, that they could use to look at supporting particularly the most vulnerable. There's lots of debate about whether it should fall to Glasgow City Council. Of course, this is a UK government policy. It's an absolutely horrendous UK government policy, and nobody in Scotland should be having to pick up the pieces of that. That's not a debate, but the fact is that they can mitigate against it. And again, they need to start talking about, you know, the honesty of that. We had a little chat about some of the other language in that response from Susan Aitken as well, and she used the word failed asylum seekers. I mean, it's just really interesting in that that's the terminology that the Home Office use, whereas I think most people who are working to support asylum seekers would say that people don't fail, that their applications are refused. It's a little point about language, but it just actually, I think, sends out another message about, you know, how the City Council are engaging with this part of the process.
It just feels like that kind of hostile environment policy, which the aim of that policy was to trickle down into all kind of aspects of society and all kind of government and local government bodies, and it feels like it is having that effect.
I think it is. It's a real shame.
And this question is, it's kind of about like who's going to have the heart and humanity to stand up to it. I mean, that's what it feels like. It's like someone can prevent these people from having to become destitute.
It was only a few years ago, of course, that what was then called the refugee crisis was underway, and Scottish local authorities were the first to say we'll take on refugees. It was a bit of it was seen as a sort of humanitarian coup for local authorities in COSLA in Scotland that they said that. And it feels a bit of a far cry from that, but most people confronted by this issue would just say, I don't really care whose legal responsibility it is. You know, it just needs to not happen. It just needs to not happen that 300 people, kids, potentially older people, are made homeless overnight. You know, that's the buck passing thing. I think people find sort of uniquely offensive in the whole affair.
Yeah, and obviously, money is the thing that's kind of, you know, unspoken in all of this, isn't it? When we took Syrians into Scotland, there was money available through the resettlement fund, so local authorities weren't out of pocket. In this situation, there's not money there. Glasgow City Council are doing an awful lot to mitigate against the absolutely horrendous austerity policies the benefit cuts and sanctions that are being rolled out from Westminster. We know that the city has issues with its budget just now, but it fundamentally comes down to the fact that you can't say there's not a duty in some of those cases. People, it is a humanitarian issue ultimately, and we do need to grapple with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many kind of wider issues around that, in terms of what the Home Office does and what Scotland is forced into. I mean, I've spoken to lots of asylum seekers. I'm sure you have too, who want to work and who want to be earning their own rent and have skills and talents that we could benefit from, but they're forced into this kind of subservient, kind of dependent relationship, which then leaves them completely helpless when something like this happens.
Yeah, and Glasgow City Council have obviously passed a motion about wanting the right to work, but seeing as that's not the case, what are we going to do right now? What are we going to do in 2 weeks' time? And I guess there's, as you say, in the city, there's this kind of tradition of standing up for people's rights, which, I think Live and Rent will quote, Mary Barber and the rent strikes, and then you had, when there were the Dawn Raid policies in the early 2000s, and you had amazing communities in Kingsway, standing up for their neighbours and keeping an eye out for immigration vans arriving 5 a.m, and now you've got a lot of people just out there campaigning for friends and neighbours as well as people they work for and all the rest of it through this campaign.
Well, I guess it's been quite a hammering for Glasgow City Council this week, and we'll kind of keep reporting on what's going on there and see if they do kind of take any actions and do respond to these, and whether there might be some hopeful improvements in the future.
And you can follow this story and everything that we've discussed this week at commonspace.scot. If you have any ideas for the CommonSpace Show, what we should be talking about, what we should be covering, what guests we should be speaking to, please send that along to us. And we look forward to speaking to you again in a couple of weeks' time.
And thanks, Karin, for joining us.
Oh, yeah.
Always forget.